Welcome back, everybody, to the Below Average Joe's MMA podcast, episode number 114. It's Wednesday, June 30th, Dom. We are halfway through summer, it looks like. Did I do that right? I think
we're halfway through the year.
That's true as well. So, man, bittersweet.
Yeah.
But we're about to hit July. July 4th is coming up.
Which is true.
So how are you doing? How are you planning to celebrate? What's going on, man?
I just got to say off the top, if you guys hear any strange sounds coming from my background, there is some construction going on at our household currently. They are building, or they have dug a hole to begin our pool. So hopefully there's nothing loud in the background. If so, I do apologize off the top. But, yeah, man, it's going to be a fun July 4th. Obviously, the pool will not be done by then, which is unfortunate. But always good to eat some good food, see some fireworks, see some family, all the fun stuff. What about you?
Yeah, I get off July 5th, that Monday, so It's going to be a nice 3-day weekend, I guess you would call it. And, yeah, I'm looking forward to some porch drinking and some –
of course.
I'm sure people – I don't know. Maybe – I don't know if I've really – celebrated 4th of July in Bowling Green before, to be honest, but if not, I'm wondering how many people will be setting off fireworks considering the residential neighborhoods. But
those college kids.
Yeah, that is true. I want to get into this actually about fireworks.
Okay.
So we come from the country.
Yeah, true.
That's where you're currently located.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of in our blood, right?
Deep down.
Firework fanatics.
Yes.
But I've just never really understood the hype, if I'm being honest. I don't get me wrong. I can watch them, yeah. But am I really watching them? No. I'm just kind of out there enjoying time
company
with friends and family. I don't give a fuck about some shit exploding in the sky. After I've seen it once, I'm good.
Okay.
It stops surprising me. It stops catching me off guard, whatever. But, I feel like I'm going against my heritage in a way, Dom.
Yeah, you're going to get roasted for this.
So what are your thoughts?
It used to be like a big deal in my family. Like when I was younger, Dad, they don't sell them in the state. Or, I mean, they do sell them technically in Ohio, but I don't know all the legal things. But we used to go to Indiana to Phantom Fireworks, and they always had like the biggest and best every year.
Hopefully the statute of limitations is passed on your dad doing some illegal activities here.
This is true. So we'll see what he's doing this weekend. But yeah, it was always such a big deal. It's not quite been like that in recent years, obviously, as we get older, and he works sometimes during July 4th. But this weekend, he will be available in the evening to see some fireworks. I'll keep you all posted on how Big Dave acts.
Maybe that's why for me, because my family just never really made that big of a deal about it. I memean, sure, we would go out and watch them like on our porches and stuff, not drinking this time as a child. But they never really made too much of a deal about it, so I guess I just don't really care about it. However, there is a nice scene in The Sandlot where they set off fireworks.
I wouldn't know.
Yeah, you wouldn't know because you've never seen it. So with that, we're just going to get into today's topic. It is Wednesday, which means this episode is just a bit extra special. And here's why. We have a huge pay-per-view coming up, Dom.
Yes.
UFC 264, headlined by the trilogy fight. More on that later. Between Conor McGregor and Dustin Poirier. That fight is so big.
So big.
We wanted to think of a topic that was very topical for this fight. And this is the video. This is totally the topic idea we had from
100%.
Day one.
Yes.
We totally didn't come up with this.
No last-minute adjustment right before we hit record or nothing.
No way.
Yeah.
But today, we are essentially just going down a history of some of the UFC's most important, biggest, best, worst, memorable trilogies. You'll see what the title is. It's going to have one of those words in there.
One of them. We don't know.
So I just figured I'd get them all.
Cover all of them. Yeah.
But we're going to go in kind of reverse chronological order by kind of the last fight. It's kind of
most
weird,
recent to oldest.
Yeah, by when they ended.
Yes.
So it's it'll be an interesting way of going through it. But you guys will get it.
You'll catch it. Yeah.
Yes. And we start with one we've talked about already on this podcast. The most recent one, we got to go through the final fight of this trilogy, that being for the heavyweight title. All three of those fights taking place for that belt. Stipe Miocic versus Daniel Cormier. Dominick, I still stand by this. I think this is over time.
I agree with you on this.
I'm a little nervous that over time this trilogy is going to become a bit overlooked in the history of the sport. It's going to
I think it already is.
I think it is in a bit. I mean, just Stipe in his career in general, I think is going to unfortunately get a little bit overlooked just because he's a dad. He just kind of does his own thing. He likes to grill. He doesn't really make a big fuss about it. Yeah, he doesn't make a big fuss about himself. However, I stand by that this is the most important trilogy we're going to talk about today in terms of legacy, implication. I mean, all three fights for a title. Two guys at the top of their game, looking to get that edge over the other in terms of being the best heavyweight of all time and being a top 10 fighter in the UFC of all time. So much at stake in these fights, and that third fight in particular. I still stand by that third fight was the most important title fight in UFC history. If you go off of why we enjoy title fights, what the point of them are, competition.
Who's the best?
And I thought these were two guys that were so neck and neck.
Coin flip.
Yeah, I mean, and Stipe wins, so he is the best heavyweight of all time.
Yeah, and I love what you said about legacy. This is like far and above compared to the other 9. We got a top 10 list here that we're going to touch on in terms of legacy, the most important, biggest implications, all 3 of them for belts, which you don't see very often. And the fact that it went knockout for DC, knockout for Stipe. And what better way to end a trilogy than with a 5-round back-and-forth brawl that could have went either way? I mean, it was absolutely just – this is the ideal, perfect trilogy, if I'm being honest with you.
Yeah, in many ways it is. And, there is some things that you wish didn't happen in the trilogy. The first fight, DC was kind of eye-poking Stipe, and that may have blurred his vision for the finishing sequence. And then in the last fight, Stipe fucked up DC's
that was
eye,
nasty.
And that definitely had him compromised for the rest of that fight. But regardless, I don't think, no matter what, though, I think the guys who won each fight, I thought were the best guy that night.
Yep.
And Stipe gets the win, so that doesn't hurt for us enjoying it.
The Ohio boys love that.
But that's a big one. So we're actually going to follow that up with one of my least favorite trilogies, and it starts off so great. That's the thing, Dom. Before you show the headline, I gotta
suspense. Build the suspense.
I gotta explain myself a little bit. So much of what makes a good trilogy is that last fight. That's really what brings it all home.
Yeah.
Your first 2 fights can be great, back and forth. They can be wars, awesome, whatever. But in a lot of ways, they're set up. It's just like if you go to the movies. If you watch, or a TV show.
Yes.
Actually, a TV show is probably a better example. Game of Thrones.
I've never seen that either.
Okay. Which, that's more understandable. You don't have HBO.
Okay.
But it's one of the best shows of all time.
Yes. So
until you get to the last 2 seasons. And then it kind of falls apart.
Yeah.
So seasons 1 through 6 are fantastic, but seasons 7 and 8 are pretty bad, and they really bring down the rest of the show with it. So that's much how I compare it to a trilogy fights. Each one builds on the other. If the last one doesn't really live up, then your trilogy is just kind of and that's unfortunately what happened with 2 of the biggest names in UFC history, in Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz. Man, Chuck Liddell got the upper hand in both UFC encounters, UFC 47 and 66.
Which makes you wonder, why do we have a trilogy anyway?
True. But those fights were so massive.
Yeah.
And, Tito Ortiz was such a big name at that time, such a cocky, asshole, while Chuck was kind of the blue-collar man, I don't know.
Man. The 2 superstar, fire and ice on the trunks, man. It was
they couldn't be more opposite. They couldn't be more opposite.
They had the backstory, former training partners.
Yep. I mean, Dana was the manager for both of them.
Yeah.
Prior to becoming president of the UFC, he maintained his friendship with Chuck. Did not do so with Tito. That would have been fun if that could have ever become a trilogy of fights boxing match. Talk about some shit boxing. I would have loved to see Tito Ortiz versus Dana White back in the day.
Tito came out to like a press conference with a shirt saying Dana White is my bitch. That was standing right next to the guy, by the way. So
yeah.
They are not the best friends.
Yeah, but as far as this trilogy of fights, the first two are fantastic, man.
Yeah.
Back and forth. Chuck gets the upper hand in both of them, finishes both of them, but they leave such a lasting impact that even for Tito, as a guy who loses both of them, it doesn't really hurt his legacy, in my opinion.
Yeah.
He didn't come out on top, but he needed to beat Tito in those fights for those fights to be as massive as they were. So those fights, that's what the 30 for 30 talks about a lot. Highly recommend
Such a
that
good one, yeah.
Unfortunately, though, what bogs it all down, you see it at the end there.
Yeah.
Oscar De La Hoya, you son of a bitch. You come in to the MMA space and you take Chuck and Tito, who at least
past their prime.
And mind you, this fight, those first two fights, I believe the second one happened in 2006. The Golden Boy MMA fight was 10 years later, I want to say. No, it might have been 2017.
Both men in their 40s. Okay.
Well, I believe Chuck was in his 50s. Or he was 49 or something.
Pain.
Tito was in his 40s, but Tito at least still
had been fighting.
He had been active, and he hadn't looked bad.
Yeah.
Like, honestly, like, he was fighting in Bellator and guys like Chael Sonnen. He was fighting other guys that were kind of past their prime at that point. But he still looked in good shape. He was still fighting at a relatively high level. Chuck Liddell was essentially
brought off the couch.
He was taken out of the sport by Dana White and the UFC because his chin couldn't withstand a punch. He got knocked out in about 3 or 4 straight fights, cold.
And he didn't want to retire.
Yeah, and Dana was like, look, you got to retire. Gave him a job within corporate that lasted until the WME. Wait, what was the company? Who owns
WME? Endeavor.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. WME came in and bought it, and that's when he kind of lost his job there, and that's unfortunately, I think, what kind of spiraled into this madness. But these two, this fight was just made me so sad.
Yeah.
Because Tito just knocks out Chuck in like 3 minutes or whatever.
Very uncomfortable to watch.
It's very uncomfy because Chuck looked so slow.
Yeah.
He looked so old. And I stand by, even though Dana White, promoter, you can say whatever about him having people's best interests. His comments about this fight, I totally agree with. Who allowed this fight to happen?
Yeah.
I mean, come on. It was embarrassing.
It was sad, really.
The fight didn't even sell well at all.
Well, no one was asking for this trilogy. No one.
No. I mean, for one, Chuck won the first 2 fights.
Yeah.
And two, this is 10, 11 years after this rivalry had any real relevance in MMA.
Yeah.
Dom, that's what makes me the most sad is that these two were banking. Their pay was essentially based on pay-per-view buys, and it didn't even crack I think it cracked I want to say 90,000, which that's bad. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
It's just sad because that means they didn't really make the money that they thought they would. I mean, I think they were projecting like 400, 500,000 pay-per-view buys, and you get a fraction of that.
Yeah.
It just makes this whole event makes me sad.
It's the definition of unfortunate.
And that's why this trilogy is ass. Screw you, Oscar De La Hoya, for taking our boys and muddying them all up.
2 of the biggest legends of the fight game, man.
Yeah. But I'm ready to move on from this one.
Let's digress from there. Let's simmer down.
So we're going to get into kind of a lame duck one, in my opinion. And that's Dominick Cruz and Urijah Faber. A solid trilogy of fights. Their third fight was a UFC 199, which is the first ever event.
Let them know.
Yeah, it's the first ever event I watched. My thoughts on that fight the first time I watched it are the same. I didn't even know that it was the third time they fought when I watched it the first time. And now when I go back, I still don't feel any differently about it. Like, to me,
all Dom.
Yeah, I mean, the first fight, Dominick Cruz was so young in his MMA career. Uriah Faber was a huge star
he was
already.
starching people. Yeah.
And it was Dominick Cruz's first professional MMA loss. And after that, though, Cruz went on to just become another level above Faber.
Arguably
Faber,
the greatest bantamweight ever.
The second fight, was probably where they were both at pretty neck and neck, but Cruz won that one pretty easily. And then the third fight was when Faber was kind of past his prime.
Yeah.
And Cruz won that one pretty easily. So this trilogy didn't do too much for me. None of the fights especially stand out, in my opinion, as being fantastic. Even the first fight, I think, ended under a minute. I think Faber catches Cruz
in a submission.
Yeah, he catches him in a guillotine. And I think it's under a minute. But the next two fights, I believe, go to 5-round decisions, and neither one of them are really –
not many people are beating Dominick Cruz in a 5-round decision outside of Cody Garbrandt. So.
I like the third fight enough. I don't really remember the second one, but the third fight's okay. It's just as a trilogy, this one's just kind of whatever to me. And really, even the trash talk, Cruz just talks circles around Faber.
He's just such like an intelligent trash talker. It's kind of odd. It doesn't it's not like he cusses you out or anything crazy. He just like outsmarts you, if you want to say that. He did it to Cody too in the trash talk. The one thing I will say about this trilogy that's cool is this is essentially the two pioneers of like the lower weight classes, the men's bantamweight division for MMA. And for that, I think it always hold at least a little special piece of MMA history there.
Yeah, I would actually say probably the biggest thing I enjoy about this rivalry is what came after, and that Cody Garbrandt really got his rise.
Yeah, it built that.
Yeah, he was Uriah Faber's kind of protege, and he comes in to fight for him. Really, that's kind of how it was built up as. He had earned his title shot, but he comes in and beats Dominick Cruz in a 5-round decision that nobody expected him to do. Yeah. And that's probably going to be the biggest win of Cody Garbrandt's career.
Yeah, Dominick Cruz was known as the team alpha male killer, and for Cody to go in and avenge kind of his team at UFC 207 was huge. So,
yeah, we're gonna follow that up and go up a few weight classes at
big
heavyweight.
Boys.
This was in some ways this was Stipe DC before Stipe DC.
Yeah, you get away to put it.
Cain Velasquez versus Junior Dos Santos. The reason I say that is that these were two guys that were looked at as potentially heavyweight goats, in their time. Neither one was quite – JDS had a great career. Cain Velasquez, great career. Cain Velasquez, unfortunately, career cut short.
Yeah.
Although he probably could have been. Really,
one of the greatest.
If injuries didn't hold him back, that guy could be probably the best of all time, heavyweight-wise. JDS just,
a legend.
Great career. And he wins the first fight on the debut
for made
the
history
UFC on Fox. In some ways, they kind of ruined the debut for Fox because
what a debacle
I believe they were given an hour time slot. The rest of the fights, it was just a one fight. One fight gets shown on Fox, and it's this main event between Cain Velasquez and JDS. I believe the rest of the fights were shown on like Facebook or something.
Yeah, whatever the prelims stuff is. Yeah.
And they give it an hour because this is a 5-round title fight. And JDS goes in there and knocks out Cain Velasquez in a minute.
Yeah.
A minute.
Therefore, leaving quite a bit of airtime to fill up.
Dom, you know how long a minute is when you have an hour airtime?
If my math's right, that means there's 59 minutes left.
Correct. And yeah, sure. You might have some entrances in there or whatever.
Yeah.
But let me put it this way. There was a lot of awkward talking afterwards among commentators because it just blew up in their face. You depended on the single fight to go at least 3-4 rounds,
a little bit longer.
That both these guys' styles, they were both so never had shown a ability to not take a shot. I don't know if either guy had been finished in their career at this point.
Yeah,
Cain Velasquez looked unbeatable. JDS looked like he was a straight killer.
Yeah,
and he kind of showed it on this night. And this was the first time that you saw Cain Velasquez's cardio Just, this was only a minute fight, but he just didn't look right here. And that's what always happened to him whenever he would go and fight at elevated levels. Because I think this card happened in Colorado, if I'm not mistaken.
And it's weird because he's known as Cardio Cain. It was so strange.
But then he fought here in Denver or Colorado, wherever it was.
Yeah.
And then he fought later against Verdum in Mexico City, both at very elevated surfaces. Didn't train there in the lead up. And then his cardio this fight was only a minute, but he just didn't look right.
Yeah.
The second fight, his cardio wouldn't hold up. Cain, I don't know what his mindset was at that time. Regardless, this trilogy of fights, though, first fight was a 1 minute knockout. JDS new champion. These next two fights, people.
Oh man,
beatdowns.
Brutal.
Absolute beatdowns. Cain Velasquez takes JDS to school for 10 rounds straight. And honestly, by the second fight, because it finally gets stopped in the fifth round of the second fight, or the third fight, excuse me. You just feel sad, sorry for the guy. JDS such a nice guy, and you just see he almost has this puppy dog look on his face, and you're just like, oh my God, throw in the towel, please.
Yeah,
it's bad. But
credit to him, I guess, for being tough and hanging in. But
withstanding the punishment is definitely a credit to him. But because of that, this trilogy for me has always been this is Cain Velasquez's kind of coming out party.
Yeah,
where it's this really showed people, I think, how good Cain Velasquez was. Yes, he got knocked out in the first one, but I think a lot of people after that first fight may have thought, well, maybe Cain was just beating up on some people that weren't as good. He won the belt from Brock Lesnar, who a lot of hardcore MMA fans were always kind of
skeptical.
Hot and cold. Skeptical. Yeah. And then gets knocked out by JDS in a minute. I think a lot of people might have been overlooking Cain. And then he comes back and just puts on an absolute showcase for 2 straight fights.
2 masterclass performances.
And if I remember correctly, what's interesting about this trilogy is I don't think any of these 3 fights were immediate rematches.
No, I think there were fights between all of them.
So, I like that, where each guy went back and earned it.
Yeah.
Even though for JDS, unfortunately, the result was the same in the last 2. But regardless, decent trilogy in terms of it's probably a good trilogy in terms of impact. But as far as the fights themselves, none of these are
they're all really decisive.
Yeah, unless you want to watch the second or third fight for morbid curiosity. I wouldn't necessarily say any of these fights are memorable besides that.
Yeah, no back and forth wars in this one. Right. But I think the next one's got a little bit of back and forth war added to it.
This one's interesting because this is our only trilogy that does not have a decisive winner at the end.
This is true.
They are 1-1-1, and you know who we're talking about. That is Frankie Edgar versus Gray Maynard. Frankie loses the first fight to Gray on a fight night when both guys are so young.
Yeah.
I believe that was on the prelims of the fight night.
Crazy.
Just showing just how young they were at the time. Then the next 2 fights are both for the belt. UFC 125, one of the best fights of all time.
Was that on the list? I don't remember, but wow, what a fight.
Whoa.
And you want to talk about a guy coming back, too, after getting beat down early. The way that Frankie came back, unbelievable.
This was before 10-8 rounds became more common.
Yeah.
This was like a 10-7.
Yeah.
Frankie Edgar gets dropped 4 or 5 times.
4 times in a round. Yeah.
And looked 2 or 3 of those looked like he was out on his feet. Somehow is able to kind of just will himself through the round and somehow comes back the rest of the fight and debatably wins it.
Looks
on
awesome.
The scorecards.
Yeah.
It ends up being scored a draw. So then you set up an immediate rematch at UFC 136. Edgar, more decisive win. I believe he knocks out Gray in the 4th round. Nasty knockout in that one too. So, in a way, it felt like a decisive end. I don't think anybody was clamoring for a 4th fight.
True.
After that, just because it's I think we've seen it. We
would have to call it a saga at that point.
Yeah, I just didn't I don't think anybody was oh, let's see a 4th one. It's just kind of okay. it felt like a very decisive end to their run because Frankie just showed how much he had improved, or maybe he showed that first round of the second fight was a bit of a fluke, whatever it might be. He was able to come back and put a very good bow on a great trilogy of fights with Great Maynard by kind of piecing him up and finishing him in the third fight.
Yeah, that was when Frankie was really starting to hit his stride in that lightweight division too, man. And we see what he's still kicking it today in bantamweight, so it's crazy, man, how far he's come. But yeah, that's an incredible trilogy. Anyone who hasn't seen the fight on UFC 125, the draw, you need to go watch it as soon as you're done listening to this podcast.
You know what's unfortunate? Great Maynard's so close to winning the title in that second fight. Really, after this trilogy, he was never really the same again.
It's true.
He definitely fell off after this. I remember he had the really tough fight with Nate Diaz where Diaz really beat the shit out of him for the majority of it. It's just one of those things that those wars those guys put on each other. Frankie was able to hold up over time.
Yeah, two total opposite directions.
Yeah. Gray just not quite able to. But otherwise, a great trilogy. The first fight's just so forgettable. It's really the two fights, the 125 and 136. Those are the ones that people remember. And UFC 125, it's one of the best fights of all time. We've talked about it on our top 10 title fights, I believe.
One of the old ones. Go listen to it if you haven't already.
Moving on from there. Now this is really the era, man. This is where all these trilogies really happen.
Kidding, man.
So many. Right here after Frankie and Maynard, that one ended in like 2010, 2011.
Yeah.
And this next one will be too. But these next like 5 trilogies we're going to talk about, most of their work came in like from 2004 to 2008 kind of deal. Just kind of wild how many trilogies.
The era of trilogies, dare I say.
So we move on to BJ Penn versus Matt Hughes.
Oh, man.
This is an interesting one because there's a big gap between fights 2 and 3.
Yeah.
However, I want to start with the first fight because BJ Penn, as most of you are probably aware, is considered one of the best lightweights in MMA history.
The prodigy.
That's where he did most of his work, was that lightweight. He was very natural at that time to that division. Matt Hughes was a tank of a man, but a welterweight.
One of the best ever at that weight class.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Definitely someone that if you guys are newer fans, highly recommend you go and watch some old Matt Hughes fights. That guy was
a beast.
But he was a welterweight, a huge welterweight at that. And BJ Penn decides he's going to go up to welterweight to challenge Matt Hughes. Not a lot of people giving him much of a chance here. You got BJ Penn, who, it's again, this is Matt Hughes' weight class. BJ Penn was not necessarily a huge lightweight.
And during this era, you didn't see this. You didn't see guys jumping back and forth weight classes, trying to get a belt in another weight class. BJ really kind of set the pace, set the tone for this very, very early on in the company.
Yeah, and within the first round, you could just tell that something's different because Matt Hughes, so used to bullying people in the octagon with his wrestling, slamming people like he did Frank Trigg across the cage and all that.
You want to talk about a great comeback, too. Go watch that fight. That was crazy.
However, BJ is being the aggressor here, slamming Matt Hughes, holding him on top, not letting him loose, not giving him an inch of space. And by, I believe it's like 4.5 minutes around number 1, he gets the rear naked choke on Matt Hughes, chokes him out.
People were stunned.
Yep. Couldn't believe it. That BJ Penn, as great as he was, as people knew he was, that he had just beaten Matt fucking Hughes, who I have to stress was such a just unbeatable force at that time.
A freight train. Literally destroying people.
Sure, if a different guy was the welterweight champion, BJ Penn you would look at him and be like, that guy, he could totally win that fight. Because BJ Penn was so credited in his own right.
Yeah.
But when he was going up to fight a brick of a man, a brick wall, if you will, and Matt Hughes, nobody gave him a chance.
No.
And he steamrolled him.
Shocked the world.
the two fights after that, though, you kind of have – so I think that was B.J. Penn's first title win in the UFC, and then he would later go on to win
at
the lightweight belt because there's the history of the lightweight belt, and I guess I can talk about this a little bit. It's kind of interesting, but it's a bit of a tangent. The UFC had a 4-man tournament. I believe the first 2 bouts happened at UFC 39, and then the championship bout, if you will, was at a UFC 41, I want to say. And this 4-man tournament, on one end you got Cal Uno versus Dean Thomas. The other end you got BJ Penn versus Matt Serra.
Yeah.
Cal Uno and BJ Penn win their respective fights, so then they're put in the title fight to determine the first ever UFC lightweight champion. However, much like the introduction of the men's flyweight title, there's some shenanigans. Your title fight ends in a draw, so there's no champion.
Just awkward.
So then the UFC just kind of don't really crown a champion for a while. Then they kind of bring it out, like Sean Shirk held the belt at one time. And that's where BJ Penn's like, Sean Shirk, you're dead.
Yeah.
All that.
Licking the blood off of his gloves.
Yep. So BJ Penn wins the welterweight belt, even though he's a natural lightweight, because there was no real lightweight belt to be had at that time.
Title fight. Yeah.
But he would later win the lightweight belt in that fight with Sean Shirk, I believe. I believe Shirk had been stripped because he had tested positive for PEDs.
The muscle shark.
Or no, actually, Penn won it in a fight with Joe Daddy Stevenson. That's what it was. The bout where he messed up Joe Stevenson. I mean, bloodied him up. Stevenson was crying at the end.
Yeah. BJ was a killer, man, in his prime.
You guys, newer fans might not realize it because of the unfortunate kind of ending of his career.
Yeah.
But that guy at one time was the total package.
Yeah.
Now, later, Matt Hughes would get that win back at UFC 63. Pretty one-sided fashion. I mean, he did much more of what you thought he would do. He kind of overpowered BJ. When he got him in top control, he did a really good job of putting him in a crucifix.
Yeah, just Matt's grappling was so good in the day, man.
Nasty ground and pound. And then you kind of get a weird gap before UFC 123, which I believe is Matt Hughes' retirement fight. Mm-hmm. He gets knocked out by BJ Penn in 21 seconds. And if this hurts even more, this is the last win of BJ Penn's career, but he would go on to fight for about a decade longer. Yeah. So Dominick, what do you kind of think about this after I really laid out a lot of history for you there?
Well, I mean, when I think of my childhood and first getting into the UFC, these were like two of the faces of the company at the time. You had the Chuck and Titos, you had BJ Matt Hughes, you had Anderson Silva debuting in 2006. Those were like the guys, the faces of the company, all in different weight classes. And so when this happened, it was just so historical. It's still two of the greatest ever, regardless of how their careers may have ended. And, of course, all the unfortunate stuff with Matt Hughes now. Thank goodness he's doing better and the UFC's helping him there. But two straight-up legends of the UFC, legends of mixed martial arts. And it's so good that two guys like that got to have a trilogy with one another.
You know what? Couldn't have said it any better myself.
Poetry.
We're going to stick with Matt Hughes here.
He likes some trilogies.
He likes losing some trilogies at that. But this one, I mean, come on. These are all GOATs we're talking about here.
I mean,
George St-Pierre.
You could argue these are the two greatest welterweights of all time. Still to this day, you can make this argument.
I completely agree with you. I know, don't get me wrong.
We've got Usman and Woodley catching Hughes. But
Usman, you could make an argument as second at this point, but real OGs know.
Matt Hughes is
the man.
He's up there.
Now, he does like losing some trilogies, though.
True.
Here, he was on the losing end of a trilogy against George St-Pierre, UFC 50, 65, and 79. GSP only has 2 losses in his professional MMA career. Yep. First one being to Matt Hughes, a young GSP, a very slick way to lose too. He caught GSP in an armbar at the end of round 1 of their first fight at UFC 50. GSP tapped with 1 second left in the round.
Unfortunate.
He tapped
What if GSP never tapped?
Because GSP was very competitive in that round.
Yeah,
I mean, he
and
was
we're
a
still
young
talking
guy.
a young GSP.
This is a young GSP that he would grow a lot after his second loss to Matt Serra, because after that he became more risk averse and played a more safer style, a more complete fight, if you will. But here he was very energetic, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the word. He was very fast, very quick moving around the octagon. Not that changed necessarily, but he played it more safe in his later fights.
He was
Here,
so methodical and strategic.
Yeah, here he was just so different. It was just like a guy having fun in there.
Something about GSP versus guys that are named Matt, I guess.
Yeah. But that first fight of Matt Hughes, man, I'm telling you, it's crazy. Like, as soon as Hughes put that armbar on, GSP tapped. He probably could have just not.
Yeah.
And had been fine.
But Matt may have snapped his arm in half.
Maybe. But, I mean, it was like 1 second left, man. However, GSP would come back from this. He would go on to beat Matt Hughes in pretty decisive fashion in their later two fights. Matt Hughes at that point, even at UFC 65 and 79, he was definitely past his prime at that point, which is what's crazy about the guy fighting until UFC 123. But GSP was really the passing of the torch, that UFC 65. Yeah. Sure, they would have their trilogy, but really the third fight was kind of like it was inevitable because Matt Hughes was still winning. Yeah. But everybody knew at that point that the tide had changed. You know, the first fight, GSP's the young up-and-comer, but Matt Hughes is king. And now Matt Hughes is on the decline, GSP king. That's what you got with the next two fights. And, you know, it's a great trilogy. I think it's a very underrated one. All three ended in a finish. Yeah. I believe all three are for the title. I can't. Yeah, I think so. Because Matt Serra beat GSP at UFC 69. That would be the next fight after the second Matt Hughes one, which is kind of what's interesting, is you kind of passed the torch, but then he lost his next fight. Right. One of the biggest upsets ever. So small blip on the radar there, right? Yeah. But otherwise, it's a great trilogy. Highly recommend all three of these fights. They're all really fun to watch. These two, very respectful with one another. Not a very, you know, you see
the post-fight interview, man. Yeah. I'm not impressed with your performance. He wasn't even trying to be mean, but it came off as just so awkward. Trash talk, man.
Hilarious. But that's just how these two were. They were very respectful in the octagon. They didn't use their mouth a lot, but it's still one of the best trilogies of all time, in my opinion.
Yeah, and that's what I love so much about GSP and his legacy, too. And I've talked about this before, but 2 losses ever in his entire career. Both losses he avenged, and both were in title fights. I mean, it really speaks to the legend that GSP is and why he's so high up on nearly everyone's GOAT list for that simple reason right there. So
now we're going to transition into the most one-sided trilogy, if you will. Tito Ortiz versus Ken Slamcock, Shamrock.
Wow.
That's what Tito called him.
Oh, I see what you did there. Very nice.
Yeah. So this is a trilogy that, look, I mean, it was so big for the UFC at the time. That first fight, especially. UFC 40 was probably the first super fight in UFC history. I mean, this was before even Tito had fought Randy or Chuck. Yeah. Before Randy and Chuck had ever fought, which we'll talk about them in a little bit.
This is really when Tito was the face of the whole organization before those other guys like you mentioned.
And he had his battles with the Lions Den, which was Ken Shamrock's gym. I want to say he had fought guys like maybe Jerry Bolander, and then he had fought Ken's brother Frank in a losing effort. And then there was Guy Mesger, where I believe Guy Mesger beat Tito the first time. However, he beat him the first time in a situation where, oh God, I'm going to forget this now. So Tito had top position, had him on the ground, had top position. This is like UFC 20-something. This is so early on in the development of MMA. And I believe Guy Mesger was like cut, was bleeding pretty bad. So John McCarthy steps in and stands him up and has the doc look at him, clear him up a little bit. Well, then he starts the fight, but he starts it with them standing.
Tito loses his top position.
Tito ends up losing the fight, gets caught in a guillotine, I believe, and loses.
Who would have thought? Big John.
What if But he would go on to beat Guy Mesger, I believe, later, and that's where you saw the shirt. Gay Mesger is my bitch.
Yeah, it was a different time and era.
Something with Tito and is my bitch shirts is just.
Yeah, it's.
I don't know who his T-shirt guy is, but
and he's flipping off Ken Shamrock when he gets the win, and that's when he started doing when he would dig up the body, throw it in and stuff.
The grave digger celebration. Yeah. So there was a lot of animosity going into this fight. This is like the beginnings of seeing UFC mentioned on TV, the best damn sports show. They had an interview segment on there where Tito at the time, you go and look at these clips if you can find them. Tito was a great talker at the time.
He was.
That's what's so funny about now. People like
now it's so cringe, but at the time it was big.
He was really good at talking at the time, and like if he had talked the way he does now, nobody would have bought into the UFC.
Not at all.
So good on him for at least, I don't know, putting together a couple good acting performances or whatever. But Ken Shamrock was a big star because he had a guy that transitioned into wrestling. He was at WWE for a while, but also just a big name in MMA. He was there at UFC 1.
Yep.
But Tito would pretty one-decided fashion win all three of these. The first fight actually, if you go back and watch it, it's actually a decently competitive fight. Ken definitely holds his own in that one. However, Tito gets the win.
Yeah.
They would go on to fight again at UFC 61. That was the fight, along with another one of these trilogies that occurred there. However, that was the fight where Herb Dean stopped it due to Tito's ground and pound, and like after a minute and some change.
Yeah.
And then Ken jumps right up and is like, "Why did you stop it?" and all that. And even though like he was getting pummeled because of that, that's why they set up the third fight being on Spike TV instead of pay-per-view, and Tito would win in similar fashion.
I just love that it's Fight Night 6.5. That's my favorite part of that whole thing.
Technically, it's called Ortiz versus Shamrock 3, the final chapter.
Oh, yeah, this is when we were still naming events. I forgot.
But, however, on Wikipedia, they list it as UFC Fight Night 6.5. So
do with that what you will.
So, any other thoughts on this trilogy? I mean, it was really one-sided in retrospect, but huge for the time.
You can't talk about this trilogy, without mentioning when Ken flipped the chair up with the purple, like, Undertaker lighting at the press conference, and Dana's like, what just happened?
He catches the chair.
Yeah, it's just, I don't know what Ken did to that chair, but it flipped up like it just jumped off a trampoline. It was just crazy.
He literally kicked it straight up in the air and straight into Dana's hands.
Oh, it's like really majestic.
Dana looked surprised that, like, he caught it. Like, I don't even think he knew that the chair had been kicked. It just all of a sudden was in his hands. He's like, what?
And all Tito does is just start laughing, man. It's just you just got to talk about it.
You got to love the Ken lines, man. Like he's like on Saturday, I'm going to beat you into a living death.
Yeah.
And Tito just starts laughing, completely takes the piss out of his the shots he was taking at him, and then that's when Ken kicks the chair
goes flying. Yes,
and Undertaker lighting just on
all
10.
Purple. It was very WWE-esque.
It's looking like your color in the back.
Yeah, right here,
the back there. Very much so. Imagine that, but like Dom's whole room is just
like on color. Top of me right here. Yeah. But maybe I'll pull that out sometime in the future.
But yeah, I think we'll transition from there into a trilogy that's kind of forgotten
here.
Forgotten in a lot of ways, but maybe for good reason because the third fight doesn't really hold up. And that's going to be Tim Sylvia and Andrei Arlovski. For many people, they look at this era as a very low point in the UFC's heavyweight division.
Yeah.
I believe only 2 times in UFC pay-per-view history has the heavyweight title not been the main event, and both times were Tim Sylvia fights.
Fun fact.
Which... it's not really fair to Tim. He was really good for his time. Man.
6'8", big monster guy.
I kind of the guy gets a lot of unnecessary hate.
Yeah, I agree.
However, in this trilogy, this is kind of one of the big reasons for it. So Andrei Arlovski, one of my favorite fighters.
Yep.
Much of the reason being, in case you can't tell, UFC 51, 59, 61. When I went and started watching Fight Pass freshman year of college, I decided for some reason to start at UFC 50.
It's a mile marker. That's all.
I was like, UFC 1, I was like, I watched it. I'm like, okay, that was cool, but like, this is a lot different.
Yeah, I want some normal stuff.
I want something that's a little more of what I'm used to today, right? So I started at UFC 50, so 51, Arlovski's on there, and I'm like, who is this guy?
He was such an animal, man.
And I mean, he wins that first fight with Tim Sylvia and wins it with a heel hook in about a minute. That fight was crazy. I mean, the first punch he threw just a crazy, the right overhand, and drops 6'8" Tim Sylvia, and then immediately pounces on a heel hook. However, second fight, another first-round finish, this time for Tim. Yeah. Andrei hurts Tim again. Another right overhand drops the big man, but then Tim's able to come back and land kind of an uppercut of his own that drops Arlovski, and he's able to do the ground and pound to finish it. So you're 1-1, two very exciting fights. And then it sets up a trilogy at UFC 61, a headliner over the rematch between between Tito and Cain, showing you how much they believed in this fight.
Yeah.
And what you just said.
Yeah.
This
a little bit of a dud, huh?
One of the worst title fights in UFC history. I mean, these guys, you could tell neither one of them wanted to get finished.
Yeah.
So instead, they just kind of stood in front of each other for 5 rounds. It's in a lot of ways, have you ever seen the masterpiece that is Derek Lewis versus Francis Ngannou 1?
Very good comparison.
It is. Imagine that fight, but just 2 more rounds added to
it. Yeah.
So that's why when people tell me Lewis and Ngannou 1's the worst heavyweight fight of all time, I'm like,
hold on.
I'm like, well, at least it was over in 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And this is going to be the point I'm getting at. Now, that's why this trilogy is looked at in kind of a negative light, and why I even look at it in a negative light.
Yeah.
The first 2 fights are great. Highly recommend them. But that third fight is so bad that it feels like it's all kind of for nothing.
Much like Chuck and Tito's trilogy. That third fight just really spoils it,
it just – and this one might be even worse because, like, I could pretend that Chuck and Tito 3 never happened.
Just never happened.
It's out of the UFC. It's in this weird
one-off thing.
Yeah, one-off thing. But here, like, this is a part of UFC history.
Yeah.
So it just kind of
the line.
It really hurt both guys' careers too, because Tim Sylvia, I believe, in his next title defense was against Randy Couture.
Yeah.
Couture just stomped him for 5 rounds.
Yeah.
And Tim was almost released right after that.
Was never really the same.
Same with Arlovski. I believe he would even win a couple fights after this, and the UFC still released him.
Yeah.
Just kind of weird that these 2 guys were kind of scapegoats in a way, because the UFC looked at the heavyweight division as like a low point at this time. Because you look at, some of the best heavyweights in the world were looked at as being in pride.
Yeah, true.
And then you had guys like Randy Couture, who had retired. Frank Mir had his motorcycle accident.
Yeah.
So he was still like kind of out of there.
Mark Coleman at this time wasn't what he was at one point.
You had guys like Rico Rodriguez that had came and went.
And that's
Josh
why
Barnett.
Yeah, and Andrei was kind of one of the characters, if you will, during that time. The body hair, the physique, he was a police officer, the hair was wavy, the fang mouthpiece.
Yep.
He was kind of one of the guys at the forefront of the division. And for the 2 great fights, that started 51 and 59, to have a dud like that at UFC 61 definitely puts a damper on that trilogy.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. But I still think, like, you can watch those first 2 fights and have a lot of fun with them.
Perfect way to describe it.
And I think there's no better way to end than with kind of the OG trilogy. Yeah. Chuck Liddell versus Randy Couture. Dominick, these guys were in their trilogy in the biggest blow-up or explosion for the UFC, the tough boom. These guys were the coaches on the first season of The Ultimate Fighter.
So special.
Is there another – I can't think of another trilogy that either has occurred or even in the future will occur. I can't even imagine one happening that will so like seamlessly flow with the growth of the sport.
That's fantastic way to put it. No, I don't believe we will. It definitely not in the UFC. It'd have to come in some other organization because, like you said, Tough had just happened, and it boomed with Forrest and Stefan in the finale. Then right after that, you've got your two coaches ready to square off, and then they just have such an incredible trilogy. Two legends of the fight game. Really one of the greatest of all time for sure.
Yeah, the first fight was the one that Randy Couture won.
Yep.
And that was a fight where going in, this was supposed to be Chuck Liddell getting a win over a big name. Yeah. Randy Couture was already, I think, 40 at this point.
Yeah, so what an odd career of Randy Couture.
So they were already like, okay, this guy is slowing down.
Yeah. That
wouldn't end up being true. But regardless, Chuck kind of got stomped by Randy in the first fight. Just Randy always, when you counted him out, the guy he would do it to Chuck here. Yep. Then he would do it in his next fight when he won the belt from Tito, where he slapped him on the ass and all that.
It's one of my favorite moments ever.
So Chuck loses a tough fight there, but then he comes back, coaches the first season of Tough, and then knocks out Randy in fights 2 and 3.
Yeah.
And really, that was what he needed. He needed those victories, maybe even more so than the Tito ones, to establish himself as the face of the franchise.
Yeah, launched him into superstardom.
Yeah, right. And, I think that trilogy, him winning that, is ultimately what propelled him in there. And that's, I think in a lot of ways, not that – I don't want to act like Randy winning this trilogy would somehow alter history and the UFC is not as good, because I love Randy Couture. But I think it was good for the longevity's sake that Chuck won while the UFC is blowing up and getting bigger.
Yeah, and you just look at like a marketability standpoint, Chuck with the tattoo on his head, the mohawk, the trunks with the icicles on him. He's knocking out everybody or getting knocked out. I mean, he had everything about him during this time. The aura around him was superstar. It was Chuck Liddell, the face of the UFC.
Yeah, and I mean, that's really going to kind of wrap it up what we're talking about here. I mean, great discussion, I think, for being a topic that, we obviously did not come up with right before we started recording.
Yes, this has been planned for months, for this specific day.
I think, being able to look back on kind of these trilogy of fights that have happened, some great, some kind of in the middle.
But all hold their place.
Yeah, they all really do. Like, each one, it's kind of like if you go through like a history museum, not everything in that museum is like great. Some of it's kind of bad. But
it's there for a reason, right?
But it's all there. It all tells the story of the history of that thing, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And I think the UFC, these trilogies, I don't think you can tell the history of the UFC in its full length without including these guys and their fights in there.
Yeah.
And that's going to stay true with next Saturday, Conor McGregor, Dustin Poirier.
It's going to be massive.
I mean, if you just want to briefly, we can just kind of say, like, first fight, each one ends in a knockout, 1-1, going into the third. That's always nice.
6 years apart from 1 and 2.
You do have a weird thing where there's a big gap between fights 1 and 2, but then 2 and 3 both happen in the same year.
Yeah.
So there is kind of a weird time thing going on there. But regardless, this feels like the UFC's making a big deal out of this, and they should, because you got two big names. Dustin Poirier, after his win, he looks like he's blowing up now. Guy's on talk shows. He's selling hot sauce.
Yeah,
he's riding high. And
Conor's Conor, right? So,
but looking forward to that. But still don't have confirmation for the audience on if we're going to do an episode
Friday. A couple things have came out for the week, that's for sure. We just don't know if we're talking about it on Friday yet or not.
Probably more than likely going to do an episode on Monday.
Yeah,
Friday.
Give a couple extra days for some news.
Yeah, so we just want to make sure we get some news on there, really fill it out. We don't want to come at you.
We don't want to come on for 15 minutes and leave.
So let's plan for Monday. And then obviously next week, that Friday will be another weekend preview. But the big one, UFC 264, Conor versus Dustin 3. Till then, Dominick, tell the people where they can find you on social media.
Find me on Twitter, on Instagram, at DSlee14. And, of course, most importantly, go interact with us, follow us, engage with us on Twitter, on Instagram, at BAJ_MMA podcast.
You can find me on Twitter, Instagram at ntbaker_. If you go to my bio, there's a link to the link tree. It has all the platforms the podcast is on. So Spotify, Google, Apple Podcasts, along with the YouTube channel. Our social medias are on there. And there's a couple links for the Anchor page. If you want to leave a voice message and let us know your thoughts on next week's big main event in Conor versus Dustin, or even the co-main event, I'd like to hear some thoughts about Stephen Thompson, Gilbert Burns. Let us know, and we'll include them in the episode and give you our thoughts.
Yes, please send them in. We want to get a bunch of people if we can. That'd be awesome.
Nice. It'd be really nice. Also, there's another link for if you want to donate to the podcast. All that money is going to go back into improving the quality of the podcast. But appreciate any support. That's it. We're out. And we're going to see y'all on maybe Monday.